So we've reached the 10th video on this little barn find of a Unimog 421. And I gotta say, a while back I was thinking that we'd be able to knock this out in 10 videos. But, yeah, I'm just gonna call it. I don't think I'm gonna get it quite done in this one. I've been getting a little carried away with my video making, so it's taking a little bit longer. Well, the work is all the same, but it's taking a little bit longer to show it. But that just means you guys get a few more videos to watch. Anyway, I would like to at least get this rolling chassis done. We still have the brakes to do, we have some this and that on the engine, and just a bunch of little things all around, so let's get to it. So I would like to start by getting the brakes done and all the other little things on the lower half of this. Okay, so this truck is actually old enough that you don't just go and buy new brake liners and drums and all that. Well, you could, of course, but as long as nothing is actually broken and the drums aren't completely worn out, the more correct thing is to just get some fresh parts for it and then refurbish all of this. So that's what we're gonna do. So I'm gonna load all this in my car and take it with me to work because they have some machines I can borrow that makes this a lot more convenient. So let's just skip to that. So the actual liners of the brakes, they are riveted on, like, oops, other way, they only fit one way, on there like that. And then they have these little hollow rivets. And then we just have to squeeze those on the other side. Now on newer cars, these are typically just glued in place, but on the few heavy vehicles that are still running drum brakes, they still rivet these. So there are machines made specifically to crush those rivets, but it's very rare that we actually do this nowadays, so I don't have access to one of those machines. So I'm just going to be using this little geared hand press and make a little improvised setup. So I'm going to put the backside of the rivet on top of this. And then I'm going to be using this, which is actually the forming die from a flaring tool to make brake lines. But conveniently, this fits nicely in there, and I think it'll crush the backside of those pretty nicely. Alright, there we go. Just like that, we got this all fixed up. Well, I say just like that, but this was actually like a full day's work, so just a few more side notes to what I actually did to this. So first of all, turning out the inside, that's actually not strictly necessary as long as they haven't started getting oval. But it is a good idea. It really helps the new liners to adapt to the drums, and also you get rid of the edges in here. But there's actually several stages of repair you can do to these. So well, I'm just gonna put up a chart from the workshop manual because that makes this a little easier to explain. So it's all based on the inside diameter of the drums. Now I've turned these out to be 350 millimeters, so that makes this a stage 1 repair. And that means that the liners I put on should be 6.5 millimeters. And that is marked on them right here. And you can actually do one more stage of repair and get even thicker liners. And of course, if you exceed the maximum inner diameter of the drums, then you discard the old drums, get some new ones, and just start over with the liners. So anyway, enough talking, let's get this on here. Alright, so I don't think I've mentioned this yet. So back when we first had to get this going, I was just quickly going over the brakes, and I didn't have the correct hoses for the front, so I put these on, but you can tell they have been rubbing a little bit. If that would focus, there we go. It has a little mark right here. It turns out they've been hitting the wheel a little bit. That's because these are actually a little bit too long. I thought it was all right, turns out it's not. So I'm just gonna go ahead and get the correct ones on here that are a little bit shorter. There we go. That looks right. Nice. Okay, so I'm just now finding out that someone's been modifying this bracket to move it forward a bit more, probably to try and get some more tension out of some old cables. But that means that now that I have some new cables in here, I can't actually adjust them far enough back. And I'm just now realizing it's actually not supposed to have a bolt hole right here. It's supposed to use the bolt hole where this one is, and then the hole back here. So the whole thing has to come back a little bit. And it's also at a bit of a weird angle relative to the gearbox. So let's just do something about that. Now I can actually adjust these things. So this is really nice. Now I actually have a functioning parking brake. This is something this thing was really missing. I couldn't park this anywhere on any kind of slope without having to shut it off and leave it in gear. So that's going to be really nice to have that working again. And of course the cables are not just going to be flopping around down here. They're going to be attached to these angular bars down here. But I don't really want to fix this stuff in place until I've run my air line down to the rear diff lock, just to make sure that all this stuff is not going to be rubbing against each other. So we'll fix that later on. So before I just close this up completely, there's just one more thing we can actually talk about. That is, well, I'm not going to say that it's unique to the Unimogs, but it's something that I haven't seen on anything else. So thing is, inside the brake drums, there is this large rubber sealing ring all the way around. And it's actually taken me a really long time to figure out what the deal is with that and why it's there. Because I've also seen Unimogs where this is just left out and it's clearly not making a difference because everything else still works just fine. And it's really just sealing this solid piece of steel against this solid piece of steel. But there's just atmosphere on both sides, so there's not really anything to seal. And also I couldn't find any mention of that in any of the documentation that I have. But eventually I stumbled on a parts description of this stuff, and that kind of put me onto what this was all about. Now I think I figured it out, but I may still be wrong because I haven't met anyone who actually knows exactly. But if you know something that I don't, let me know in the comments. Anyway, here's my version of this. So to explain this, we kind of have to go back to basics a little bit. So in a solid axle, you're gonna have oil inside the axle, and that runs all the way out to the back side of this hub. And that goes whether or not you have portals on there or not. But typically on a front axle, that oil would stop right around here where you have this open end of the axle. But because the Unimogs have the portal gears out here, you still have oil inside this. So even on the front axle, you have oil right up against the back side of this hub. Now, to keep the oil in there, you of course have a seal that goes around where this axle comes out. And what typically happens when that seal goes bad is that the oil is going to start leaking onto the back side of the hub, and it's going to drip into the drum, and then that's going to smear it all over your brake shoes as things rotate. And once that happens, you effectively lose all braking power on that wheel. Now that's a pretty common fault on solid rear axles, but because the Unimogs have these portals up here, it can also happen on the front axle of these. So you could potentially, if all four go bad in a worst case scenario, you could lose braking power on all four wheels. And that means that your service brake won't work and your parking brake / emergency brake won't work either. So what they've done here is this hub is actually made of several pieces, and you have the solid piece, of course, that your wheel bolts onto, but then on the back side here, it's kind of hard to tell, but you can see there's a little line dividing it here. There's a thin sheet metal part on the back of this, and that's called an oil catch, and that's really what put me onto what was going on here. So this piece, it creates, well, it's shaped in a way that it creates a little cavity behind here, and that goes all the way along the back and in around that seal in there. So that means if the seal goes bad, instead of the oil running onto the backside of the hub, it's gonna run into this cavity in here. And you have all these little holes drilled into the hub, so the oil is gonna be flung out to those holes. And because you have that sealing ring that sits right around here, it can't go past that, so instead, it's gonna carry on through these holes in the drum, and it's gonna leak onto the outside of the drum and into the wheel. So you retain all your braking power because you're not getting the oil inside the brakes. So yeah, it really is a bit of that classic German over-engineering, but this time there is a pretty good reason for it, as it really is a safety thing, just to let you keep your brakes in case one or even all of those seals go bad, even though that is a pretty unlikely scenario. Now, I just find these little design aspects pretty interesting because I'm a nerd, but I figured someone else might have been wondering about this as well. Or at least some of you may have found it interesting. Anyway, let's get this back on here, so we can be done with these brakes for now. So that is all of the brakes mostly done. I can't really finish them up just yet because, well, the master cylinder is over here. So I can't really bleed them yet or do the final adjustments. So I'm also going to be leaving off those lower halves of these back plates because that's going to make it easier for me to get to the bleed screws and also those adjusting cams when I need to. So that's going to be enough talk about the brakes for now, because all of this stuff that I just went over, it's really quite outdated, especially on the Unimogs, because Mercedes was actually very ahead of their time with these, and already in the mid-1970s they went over to full-on disc brakes all the way around, and no one's really looked back since. And even a little later still, they did away with the whole hydraulic part and just went with full air-actuated disc brakes all the way around. Just like you find on many other heavy vehicles today, but this was definitely not normal in the 1970s and 80s. There is just one more thing that I have to take care of while we're down here by the axles, and that is these vent tubes for the portal gears out here. Just like any other gearbox, these have air and gear and oil and all that stuff inside them, and that stuff expands as it gets hot. So if you don't have a vent on it, eventually it's gonna force its way out of the seals around the axles. So you have this little vent tube. Now normally it would just vent out down here by the axle, but because this is such an off-road specific vehicle, they don't want to put the vent down here where you can also have water coming the other way. So instead it runs up along this little tube, and over here it turns to a hose and connects to this little fitting right here, so it vents inside the axle. And then from the axle housing, that's all venting through this little tube right here into these big torque tubes that are holding the axle. And it vents up along those tubes, and because this is sealed, it vents into the transmission, and then eventually it vents out this bolt right here that has a little vent hole in it. So the portal gears, they vent all the way up here just to keep the vent nice and high, so that if you are in water, you don't have water coming the other way and into your portal gears and axles. So over here on the passenger side, you can see what this tube is supposed to look like, being bent and shaped and running from this bolt down here up to the holder up here. And like I said, it was supposed to have a rubber hose from here to this fitting down here, and that's obviously missing. But also this tube is really thin. It's gonna rust through at any moment, so I'm not gonna be keeping this. I did just leave this stuff in place while I was painting the whole thing, just so I didn't get paint into the holes and threads. Now, over here on the driver's side, the whole thing is already rusted away. There's just a few pieces of it left here and there. Now, you can get these repair pieces for it, that already has the tube on it, and you just sort of bend that into shape to get it up there. But actually I'm not gonna bother doing that because this is turning into a hose up here anyway. So I'm just gonna shorten this down to something like that, bolt it on down here, and then I'm just gonna run a hose all the way from down here up through the holder and in there. Yeah, okay, that would not have held up for long. Nice. Right, so now I got both of those vent lines done, and that really means that I am mostly done with all the things that I had to do down here by the axles, except for a few grease fittings and some things that I have to tie up and whatnot, but we'll get to that later on. Now, despite being super useful, I'm getting a little tired of looking at this spigot right here, so let's go ahead and get some of the right fittings in here, and also some of the air lines and valves as well. And most of the old pipes are actually still good. They just need a little bit of cleaning and some fresh paint, and they'll just go back on there with some new seals. So I'm just now realizing I can't actually fit this last bit of pipe that has this overflow valve on it, because this was supposed to mount down here on this air tank, but this air tank that I ended up using doesn't actually have the outlets in the same place. So the way this was mounted before, it was sitting on an outlet up here in the front half of the air tank. Now that's no longer there, so I'm gonna have to use the one down here instead. That means I have to move the valve and all this stuff a little further back. That's really not a big deal, but it does mean that I'm gonna have to modify the rest of the air lines. So this means I'm gonna have to go out and get some more fittings and stuff, so I think we're gonna end this video here, because it's already getting a little too long, even though I didn't get done with half the stuff that I wanted to in this video. It turns out I talk too much, but then again, I kind of feel like you guys asked for that. So anyway, in the next one, we're gonna finish up that air system, and then we'll start putting parts back on that engine. So thanks for watching this one, and we'll see you.